Hi everyone, this is Nick Siegfried. We're here at the ABA Forum Construction Washington, D.C. Fall Meeting. I'm joined here by Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Real pleasure to be here with you. We just had a diversity breakfast where you gave an amazing presentation about the history of the Negro Leagues and your involvement with the museum and how it started. I have a number of questions for you. I know you have your own podcast, so you can talk for hours about this, and I'm sure we could see you all day, but trying to focus on a couple of things here. Okay. One question I had just to kick things off. How did the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum start?
We were incorporated as a 501c3 not-for-profit organization in 1990 and was established in a little one-room office there in Kansas City at historic 18th and Vine. 18th and Vine was the jazz district in Kansas City and still is to some extent, although we're working diligently to revitalize that area. And I tell people all the time, Nick, in its heyday, 18th and Vine was as recognized street cross-section as there was anywhere in the world, because you had that intrinsic mixture of jazz and baseball radiating from that street corner. People still come from around the world to stand on the corner of 18th and Vine and take a picture with that street sign. But like a lot of urban areas, it had died. And believe it or not, you can trace the demise of many urban communities to the loss of the Negro Leagues. And here comes this little fledgling Negro Leagues Baseball Museum establishing in 1990, and not only dedicating ourselves to building this wonderful museum to tell the story of the Negro Leagues and how it so greatly impacted American society, but also at the same time revitalize an area that had been a very proud, prominent African-American community.
And you were talking about the museum when you first stepped foot into it, the size of it. But tell us describe it for us.
Yeah, I was working for the Kansas City Star when I discovered that there was a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I didn't really know. And I'm working in the Kansas City Star, the daily newspaper's promotions department, had drawn the assignment of promoting the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum's first ever traveling exhibition, an exhibition called Discover Greatness. It is still touring the country 30 years later to this day. And so I felt like, okay, I better go down to this museum, do a little bit of background information or get some background information so that I could put the promotional campaign together to help promote this exhibition, the debut of this exhibition. This was in August of 1993. And I drive down to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum looking for it, honestly. And it was inside the historic Lincoln Building. And I go up to the third floor of the Lincoln Building to where I think this museum is, but I don't see a museum. It's an office. And I knock on the door, and the late Don Motley, who was the executive director at that time, which was a volunteer position, and I look in, I say, well, I'm looking for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he looks up at me and he smiles. He says, son, you're standing in it. It was just a one-room office, had a conference room table, had some pictures on the wall, a few boxes with some memorabilia in it, and that was the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
And I mean, I can imagine just such a piece of history. Where was everything? I mean, did they have stuff stored somewhere else, or
not really? Now, today, I'd say 95% of the items since we built our current home, I think about 95% of those items were donated by the players and or the players' families. It has only been over maybe the last decade or so that we've started to try and actively compete to bring memorabilia home. Nick, in many ways, we've become our own worst enemy. The more we popularize the story, we're driving up the price of these artifacts to the point that it makes it difficult for a small museum like ours to compete to go get them. And this is big business now. Private collectors really kind of consume most of these significant pieces, and that's their business. You know, that business seems to never go through a recession, and they'll buy these items, they'll roll them back out, they'll make 3-4 times what they paid for them, and it's just a vicious cycle. But as I tell people all the time, that's a small price to pay to give people access to a story that they never really had access before. And we've seen that grow even more over a period of time. And these things are rare to begin with because, quite frankly, the guys didn't really think they had anything special. So this stuff was kind of sitting in basements and boxes and attics, and then private collectors came to them. Now, they paid them, but they paid them pennies on the dollar for what this stuff is worth now. And so, yeah, there's still stuff out there. And we're still working as hard as we can to try and bring more pieces home because there are no insignificant memorabilia for us. Every item that we are able to acquire, that's a new story for us to bring and to tell. And so we're working as hard as we can. But, man, it's very challenging to go get that because we just simply don't have the budgets to be able to compete. I'm thrilled to say that the museum is very healthy. We have always been able to seemingly navigate the financial restraints that are out there and very challenging for cultural institutions. Museum business is difficult, but cultural institutions like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is even more challenging. And then one like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, where I've got to convince people to support a story that most of them didn't know. They didn't quite understand how significant this story was both on and off the field, but we've been able to really kind of navigate the economic landscape. The museum right now is doing extraordinarily well. Of course, you never get to rest on your laurels. You got to keep grinding. You got to keep building. And of course, we're about to step out now and build a new home, a new $25 million, 30,000 square foot standalone Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So we've got our work cut out, but I feel as positive as you can be about a $25 million project that we're about to embark on. But this is the next gigantic step for, again, a museum that started in a one-room office, man.
Right.
Yeah, and now we're talking about building an international headquarters for both Black baseball and social history as the gateway into historic 18th and Vine, or as I like to say, to build the nation's first Negro Leagues baseball campus to really educate the masses about this story, but even more so how profound it was beyond the baseball field.
I think you'll get there. I think there's a lot of interest, and I think what you've done, to grow, knowledge about the Negro Leagues and the history of it, both from a social standpoint, but also from a baseball standpoint. I think, I've just seen more and more come out about the Negro Leagues in the past 10, 15 years.
Now we've been working hard. Man. We really have to continue to try and give Negro Leagues history a mainstream voice. And honestly, Nick, I don't think that there was ever a time that people didn't want to know about the Negro Leagues. They just had no way to know about the Negro Leagues. It's not in the pages of American history books. And it's amazing to think that this incredible chapter of baseball and Americana could have escaped the pages of American history books, but it did. And as my late mother would say, you don't know what you don't know. And now you've got this wonderful museum to help educate people about a piece of baseball and Americana that they just simply did not know about, but wasn't because they didn't care about it. And that's what we're seeing every single day. People walk through that museum. They are amazed by what they learn. But to be honest, they leave a little bit dismayed by the fact that I just now had an opportunity to learn it. And you do question, how could I go through my own formal education without knowing this? Well, the answer is simple. American historians did us all a tremendous disservice. They kept this wonderful chapter of baseball and Americana away from us. Thus, countless generations of us went through our formal education without knowing this significant chapter of baseball and American history.
So one thing I didn't know that you touched on during the presentation was the style of play, the Negro Leagues and some of the things that they did that the major leagues weren't doing and the major leagues stole from the Negro Leagues. So tell us about that.
Well, and I think that's what you saw. That was the biggest difference in how the game was played. Major League Baseball at that time was essentially a base-to-base kind of game. So, guy got on base, you moved him over to second, and the big hitters came up. And
how it is today?
Kind of how it is today. Exactly.
They need to speed it up a little bit. Sorry, go ahead.
In the Negro Leagues, man, If they got a walk, that was a double.
Yeah.
You know, or they're going to drop that bunt. And then they were going to steal second. They steal third. They still home plate if you weren't too smart. And so the pace of the game was quicker. Now, the major leaguers would oftentimes accuse the Negro Leagues players of showboating. So if a guy dove in the hole, flipped it behind his back, and started double play, well, that's a top 10 Sports Center highlight every night of the week when that happens. But back then they say, oh, they just showboating. But as my friend Buck O'Neill would say, number one, if you got something to show, show it.
Yeah.
And number two, it's only showboating when you can't do it. Yeah.
It's a good point. I like that. So major leagues, another thing that I learned was the first night game.
Yes.
Where was that played and where did it?
It's one of those little known factoids around the Negro Leagues because most people give credit to night baseball having started 1935, Cincinnati, Ohio, Cincinnati Reds versus Philadelphia Phillies. Well, as I shared with the group this morning, the history book is wrong. The first professional night baseball game was in 1930, and it featured the Kansas City Monarchs. James Leslie Wilkinson, who owned the Monarchs, literally mortgaged everything he had to pioneer night baseball. He got a $50,000 loan in 1929.
Oh, it's a lot of money.
This is in the midst of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, $50,000 loan. He walks into a banker's office in the midst of the Great Depression, and he had a model truck. As a matter of fact, his grandson still has his truck. I'm trying to get it for the museum. I got to keep working on it. And a sketch of this flatbed tower system that he's going to transport all around the country. He goes into the office and says, I'm going to take night baseball all over the country. And some banker in the midst of the Great Depression said, that sounds like a good idea. Here's $50,000. Well, $50,000 is pretty good money today. But $50,000 in 1929,
yeah, that
was a lot of paper. And he builds this portable light system. They transport it. They start playing these games in 1930. And how special was night baseball? Wilkinson made his investment back in year one.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So I tell people, was it crude? Yes, it was. Buck O'Neill says the ball would sometimes get above the light towers and the ball player couldn't find the ball and they running, looking around. Okay, the ball would drop behind them. Fans double over in laughter. But it was also effective. And the Kansas City Call, proud African-American weekly paper, still produces an African-American weekly paper to this day. They said that the Kansas City Monarchs would do for baseball what talkies had done for the movies. And they were absolutely right.
Yeah. And another thing you mentioned was the Negro Leagues would play at the major league stadiums on Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
And that the major leagues would rent the stadium to the Negro Leagues.
Now, couldn't play for them,
right?
But they would rent the stadium to you.
Right.
And that was part of the reason, Nick, that it took so long to integrate the game. Major League Baseball was making money from the Negro Leagues. And so many Negro League teams were filling up these same stadiums that they couldn't play for those Major League teams in. They were outdrawing many Major League teams. But they were, in those cases, the Major League teams were getting a percentage of the gate and likely all of the concession. So those Major League teams were in no hurry to see integration because they knew that you were going to take this source of revenue away from me. And that had as much to do with keeping them out of the major leagues, maybe even more so than the social conditions of our time. I tell people, anytime they say it ain't about the money, it's always about the money.
That's true. That's true. All right, let's talk about some of the players. So obviously, let's talk about Jackie Robinson real quick. We got to talk about Jackie. You had mentioned that, you said the civil rights movement really started with Jackie. I thought that was a very interesting point.
And I don't think a lot of people had looked at his integration in that light before. But at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we do make the assertion that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement. It was the beginning of the civil rights movement. Because again, this is 1947. So this is well before the things that we kind of mark as notable civil rights occurrences. This is before Brown versus the Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as I mentioned during my presentation this morning, was merely a sophomore at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. President Harry S. Truman, born right up the road from where the museum operates, Independence, Missouri, would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackson. So for all intents and purposes, this is what indeed started the ball of social progress rolling in our country, baseball. And our country literally jumped on the coattail of baseball. So while Major League Baseball had certainly been vilified for not allowing blacks to play, when it opened its door, our country followed suit. It speaks to the reverence that baseball held and still to a large degree still holds in our society. But it was America's national pastime.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about your podcast.
Yes.
So what's it called?
It's called Black Diamonds, Untold Stories of the Negro Leagues. I do it in partnership with my friends over at Sirius XM Radio.
And what do you talk about?
We tell stories, man.
Yeah.
You know, somewhere along the line, I've gotten kind of hailed as a pretty good storyteller. And we tell stories, and then I go from being the storyteller to the interview. So we will find a guest that somehow or another connects to whatever the story that I'm sharing relative to the Negro Leagues. And it's been amazing to see how this podcast has grown in scope and scale, and that so many, a new generation of baseball fans are falling in love with these stories of the Negro Leagues. Many of them the same stories that the likes of Buck O'Neil and Monty Irvin and Ernie Banks and Minnie Minoso, these are folks that I knew shared with me, and now I get to share them, and it's hitting home to a new generation of baseball fans. What a tremendous platform the folks at Sirius XM Radio have given me and the museum. This is a national, international platform to get our message out, and we're seeing the impact of this across all spectrums of our operation. We're seeing more people walk through those turnstiles to come and see the museum. We're seeing the level of individual donations grow somewhat threefold, you know, over the time of this podcast. We are seeing more merchandise bought from both online. Of course, the more people come through the doors, you get to sell more merch inside our gift shop. All these things have a tremendous impact on our operations.
All right. This may be the hardest question. Who's the greatest baseball player of all time?
Ooh, that is a hard question. And that's almost like picking your favorite child. But for me,
got a record there.
But for me, I think Josh Gibson. I think Josh Gibson is the greatest baseball player. Black, white, blue, red, green, doesn't matter what color. Because Josh Gibson dominated this game as a catcher. If there's any such thing, he was a 5-tool catcher, you know, wow. And he not only hit for power, he hit for average. He may be the greatest hitter this game has ever seen, along with being its greatest power hitter, in my estimation. He stole bases. He was a great defensive catcher. Everywhere that Josh Gibson went, his teams won. And everywhere he played, he hit. I don't care if it was here in the United States, if it was in the Dominican Republic, if it was in Cuba, if it was in Puerto Rico, Venezuela, wherever Josh swung that bat, he hit. And so I think he might have been the most dominant baseball player of all time.
The size of his bat, you said, was 42?
40 pounds, 41 inches.
Jeez.
Yeah.
And how many home runs did he hit? 1,000, you said?
Nearly 1,000 home runs.
Wow.
In his 18-year career in the Negro League. Yeah, that's against all levels of competition. But again, I don't hold it against the fact that they had to play whoever they could play, because they didn't ask to play in the Negro League. They had to play in the Negro League. But I can tell you now, Josh Gibson lit everybody up, including major leaguers.
Yeah. Well, that was great. We could talk for hours. You have the amazing podcast. Thank you so much for sitting here and speaking at the breakfast this morning. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Man,
Thanks,
it was my absolute pleasure. It's been great to meet you. I'm coming down to Miami
All
so
right.
we can tee it up.
Let's do it.
Yeah, we can tee it up. You can teach me a few things.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. But thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you.